Thank you everybody for coming. I'm really excited to get into the discussion today. Before I introduce our panelists, I'd like to give just a little bit of background context. So the exhibition that we have on at the moment is called Mount Analogue. And it's the first group show that we've presented in the gallery. And the title comes from a novel written by René Dumas. And really it's a novel that deals with the symbol of a mountain. And the novel starts with a bit of kind of like an analysis or an overview of the role that mountains have played in myths throughout the world in different cultures and societies. Some of them, as a few examples would be Mount Meru, which comes from the Hindu and Buddhist traditions as a sacred 5-peaked mountain that becomes the link between heaven and earth. And what's interesting about this myth, and is also included in the book, is that this mountain is invisible to most people. And without a kind of without preparing oneself spiritually, it's a difficult mountain to find. And in that sense, and throughout some of the other myths, there's really this idea that a mountain is a journey in a physical space, up a mountain, but also an inward journey into kind of like a spiritual understanding. When you stand on the top of a mountain, you get a new perspective of the landscape that surrounds you. And in a similar way, when you take these inward journeys, you also get a different perspective of your environment. Another example would be Mount Sinai, where Moses goes to the top of the mountains and receives the 10 commandments from God. Similarly, in the Greek myths, Mount Olympus is where the gods live, and humans can't reach the top. They can't reach the gods without being changed in some way. I think what binds a lot of these together is this shift in consciousness, or the shift in some kind of understanding. And so I think throughout, he's kind of posturing that the mountain becomes this metaphor for an inward journey, and that's towards truth, consciousness, transcendence. And another thing that's interesting is that the mountain is both kind of marks the path and the journey towards these new perspectives, but it also becomes the obstacle. It's something that challenges you. There isn't a lot of settlement that happens on the mountains. You go with a small group of people or you go alone. And I think that that's very key here. So given that this is sort of the context of the show, and you'll see a lot of references to nature throughout the show, but in a very ethereal and a very light way. It's not directly representative, but it uses these organic forms. And so given that this was the idea behind this exhibition, and we live in Cape Town, it really seemed natural that we should have a discussion about Table Mountain, which signifies and means so much to Cape Town now, but also throughout history and the development of the city. And so we're very fortunate today to have some wonderful panelists to kind of guide us through this conversation. But at the same time, I want to invite you as the audience to really take an active part. The mountain is something that we're all familiar with, that we all have experiences with. And so if there are any questions that you have or any points that you'd like to raise, please feel free. You can just raise your hands and we can address that. So we have with us today Glenn Allard from the Iziko Museums. He's an educator, has a master's degree in science, postgrad certificate in education, and is really interested in natural history, but also heritage. And growing up in Cape Town, I think that's also a special interest. Cheryl is another Cape Town born and bred. Cheryl is a remarkable artist, and you'll see a number of her works up in the exhibition now. these etchings, this piece, which was also really one of the kind of key points in the show, which shows, the mountain here and Lion's Head and the ocean that lies in front of it in Table Bay, but it's inverted. And that I think also kind of takes this physical monolith, but turns it inward. And then Samuel.moscou, he's got the large work at the back of a mountain. Samuel was born in South Africa, but's grown up in Western Australia. And we're also very fortunate to have him taking part in the show. So to begin us off, I guess for all of the panelists with different perspectives, I would love to find out what your earliest or kind of most significant memories or experiences have been around the mountain. And I'll just sort of pass through and we can go from there, starting with Glenn. Thanks.
Thanks, Jonathan. So for me, I'm not going to talk about my first memory because I can't. I'm from here. And there's a fantastic view of the mountain from the Cape Flats, and which is kind of flat. So the mountain is ever present. But a significant memory is a narrative one. I was very close with my grandmother, my Oma. And once she showed me from the southern suburb side the shape of the old man lying on his back. And I don't know if any of you have ever seen that. If you're at Iziko, Muizenberg side, and you look at the peninsula, and you see Devil's Peak, and it looks like a forehead, and the peak is a nose, and then the saddle is the neck, and the back table, sort of like the torso, laying with his hands on his chest. And I always thought about that bit of the peninsula as a giant, a sleeping giant.
Wonderful, thank you. I just want to hop to the side quickly. It is June the 21st, and it's the solstice. So I just would like to place these for Table Mountain as an offering and a thank you for she, they that bears witness to us continually.
Is it really the solstice today?
Yeah, it is, today.
Wow.
I know. So that begs us to be closer to nature and to pay attention. And so here we are, paying attention. My closest memory was, I hear you grew up in the Cape Flats, and I know of my privilege. I grew up a road from the top of Table Mountain, and I could walk out and be in and amongst the mountain. And as a young person in the 70s and the 80s, I would literally walk out of my house onto the mountain every day of my life and feel safe as well. And I did that for my whole life until I was 20. I walked from across Table Mountain to Clifton, Camps Bay, along that route. So the smells, the plants. And another memory is summer or winter, that Table Mountain holds heat. And I never understood that. But if you live next to the mountain, it's like living next to a heater. It actually radiates that heat right back at you. And I was never cold. So this idea of a cold Cape, it never struck me until I left below Table Mountain. So that's my...
Thank you. I wanted to say that I can confirm there's definitely heat. We've been staying in, I'm going to butcher this name. What is it again? Oranjezucht. And I woke up in a hot sweat. I went to bed fully rugged up, and I woke up boiling this morning. But yeah, so I live in Perth, and it's pretty flat. We have a hill, and that's super exciting. But I've always been drawn to mountains. There's something about the scale of them sort of looming or living in the shadow of it sort of gives you perspective of how insignificant all, the sort of problems and stuff that happen in life can be. My fondest memory is probably proposing to my fiancée on Cradle Mountain in Tasmania. So yeah, I've always been drawn to it. I've always seeked them out whenever I go somewhere. Yeah.
And then, Glenn, I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit. But I'd like to ask you how the story of Table Mountain begins. And yeah, I mean, you can tackle that in any way that feels natural.
You gave me a very nice starting point, and I'm going to go back to what Jonathan was saying about Mount Analogue, not being able to reach the top unless something happens. And with Table Mountain, unknowingly, even though you think you may be familiar, there are aspects of the summit which you cannot see and you cannot conceptualize without engaging with scientific knowledge. And what makes Table Mountain special now, it reminds us of uplift, not only ourselves climbing, but a mountain climbing. And that it is actually the root of a mountain, which would have been much taller than Everest. And so what's left is the trough, right at the bottom. Oh, wow. And it makes sense once you see it, diagrammatically represented. But you would have had this mountain, a trough here, a trough at the Hottentots, Holland. And if you can imagine those two bits of sandstone connected right at the top. So this Everest-like thing that is insurmountable, unachievable, one cannot summit it. But without understanding that, by getting that knowledge, you don't actually get where Cape Town and where Table Mountain comes from. Table Mountain's really old. And that's one of the things that makes it special. As you can imagine, it takes a long time to build a mountain the size of Mount Everest, and even more time for it to erode away. But when we look at what's there, we obviously know that the rocks at the bottom are older and the ones at the top are more recent. To give you a context, the Himalayas are about 50 million years old, the Drakensberg about 180 million years old, where Table Mountain is laid down between 600 to 480 million years ago. So it's a very, very, very old piece of rock. And Southern Africa has some of the oldest rocks, exposed rocks in the world. So Barberton in Mpumalanga, those exposed rocks are about 3.5 billion years old. So South Africa is very special geologically. I want you to think about a rotten tooth or a molar that's rotting, right? So you've got this enamel shell and this bumpy top. Now imagine that bumpy top, the cap is removed. The dentine between the two enamel edges is going to rot or erode. And there's going to be these two walls of enamel. So you can think about that low part that's gone as the Cape Flats. And Table Mountain in the Hottentots, Holland are the bits of enamel that's left. And so that bit that's eroded is the bit of sandstone that capped this massive Mount Analogue a very, very, very long time ago. And so we have, I'm not going to go into the detail, which you're not going to remember anyway. But something is special about this sandstone. It was the root of this mountain. Sandstone can be quite soft. This Table Mountain sandstone is very hard because at one point it was quite deep underground, close to the mantle, and was actually cooked a bit. So when it was that deep, experiencing that heat, the sandstone became almost metamorphic, like marble, but not quite, but it was actually cooked. Africa, however, has this ascending, climbing nature itself, which makes it unique to other continents. Africa experiences this thing called uplift. It's constantly being pushed up into the atmosphere by the mantle at the bottom. We've got these massive hot plumes of magma at the bottom. So even though it erodes, it keeps being pushed up. And so we've got a very, very high subcontinent in southern Africa, the highest mean altitude in the world. And it's from billions of years of uplift. So what we see has all been underground. So Australia, the base geology is also very old, but hasn't experienced all this uplift. So you find this massive flat continent that's been eroded over time, where Africa, the plateaus and the mountains just seem to be higher, and we don't know why. Africa seems to be the lightest continental plate. It sort of floats above everything and continues rising, which I think is quite poetic. If we look at the history of its peopledness that continues, this rising against gravity, rising against adversity. So geologically, it's an old story. When the most recent Table Mountain sandstone was set down, life on Earth was very, very different. Almost everything that had anything to talk about was in the sea. On the land, we hadn't even had plants that are vascular plants today, a few mosses, a few liverworts, and some algae trying to make a life for itself. But everything else is pretty much in the water at that time in Earth's history. So the fossils we do find on the mountain, they're tiny, tiny animals. And where we find bigger animals, we're looking at the horseshoe crab. So we don't have vertebrates yet, we don't have flowers yet, we don't have cones, we don't have pollen. It's a very, very, very different world. And by the time the mountain is the mountain, we still don't have flowering plants yet. We don't have pollinators. The sky is quite quiet. So it's an interesting time to think about. You can't get to this knowledge without inevitably theorizing it. Trying to approach this knowledge summit.
Sure. Fascinating.
Sure, that's fascinating. From there, seeing as you've really taken back, and I want to come back to the point later on about the life on the mountain and the life in the region. We know that the Western Cape is one of the most kind of interesting regions of the world in terms of biodiversity. But before we get there, I also want to take us a little bit forward and think about humans' relation to the mountain, and the history of our settlement here. So I was wondering if I could ask maybe you and Cheryl what some of the common names or the stories have been or still are associated with the mountain, and to look at that, just I guess through the history and the heritage of humans in the area.
I'm going to give it to you first, then you can take a break afterwards.
No, Glenn, honestly, you talk, because I normally want to talk, but I don't.
So let's talk about people in biodiversity. And I don't want to just look at Table Mountain because it doesn't exist in isolation, even though it looks like it. One of the unique features is that it does exist apart from the rest of the Cape Fold Mountains, which can all be connected. And if you look at the map, satellite imagery, it's fantastic how you find this L shape that goes from Gqeberha through to where Paarl is, and then it just shoots straight up and terminates at the top of the Cederberg. And then there's this little bit here on the edge, which was joined by this Everest-sized mountain. But if we look regionally, and it's wonderful talking about it in a gallery and where many of the pieces are abstract. And I don't know if you know about the Blombos Cave near Stilbaai. In the Oeverberg, it's sort of between Mossel Bay and Riversdal. If you go on the N2, you'll see a turn off to Stilbaai. And there's a cave close by where the Blombos stone was found. And it's a small stone of carved ochre. And the etchings on there represent the oldest yet found abstract art in the world. Speaking to this part of the world, the cognitive contribution we've made to the species. So we don't only look at indigenous history. We look way before then when we just talk about humanity. And I think that that's very, very important. As soon as we start looking at things like ethno-linguistic or ethno-anything, we start imposing that on the structures that we've created. So our mountains and our coastlines, which have been shaped by the mountains, give birth to a lot of the abstract and the evidence for the abstract in stones like that. And that happens here at that age. That's 75,000 years ago. The indigenous people that we talk about now, and we can link that to Cape Town, we find San people, the descendants of these people that made the Blombo stone in the Middle Stone Age. When we come to the Late Stone Age, and we have San people who have been in Southern Africa for tens of thousands of years. The oldest rock art, which is valuable to track presence, is in Namibia, and that's 27.5 thousand years old. That's the oldest rock art that we have. But of course, that's just rock art. The people have been there before then. And then about 2,000 years ago, we find this massive new wave of technology that enters Southern Africa with the Khoi. These people that bring with them the skill of making ceramics, and they have livestock with them and dogs. And they move into Southern Africa and have profound changes on the landscape and social changes. Think about the Cape Flats. Do you know where Easterrivier is, or Kuils River? In one of the pages of Van Riebeck's journal that he keeps, they're on horseback, they want to go to the Easterrivier. They wait over an hour for the cattle to pass. The cattle of the Khoi, telling us that there are these massive, massive herds of cattle and sheep that are being driven by these indigenous people, the Khoi. And you can imagine the environmental impact of that, because people are determining where these cattle and sheep are moving. And of course, these livestock, they eat everything, driving away the herds of wildlife that the San would have depended on. So when we look at the time of European contact, we don't really hear about the San in this part of Cape Town, on the peninsula. We just hear about the Khoi. We start hearing about the Songkhwa and the Bosjesmans when we get to the west coast, Piketberg area. So the peninsula then becomes quite unique, because we are the San. We don't even have their rock art here. But we have this Khoi presence. And, you know, a lot of us grew up with the South African old history books of Harry die Strandloper, who's known now by his proper name of Auchumau. And the different polities that we have here that we know about are the Goringaikwa, which would have been these people with the massive herds, the Goringaikona, who are dispossessed of livestock and have this coastal diet and this trading technology. They start trading with passerby ships. And Auchumau actually spends a year in Indonesia to learn the languages and trading concepts, and is brought back to Cape Town. So by the time Van Riebeck gets there, he's already speaking Portuguese and Dutch and little bits of English. Then we have the Khokhokwa people, who are in the registration area of CY and CFR and CFM. And they also are a very cattle-rich nation. And the people who birth and nurture Kritoa. And I'm sure you've heard of Kritoa and her importance. And many of the first struggle fighters that we hear about, spoken quite eloquently in Thabo Mbeki's speech, I Am an African, speaks about this being where the hammerhead falls first, and the first political resistance to occupation and colonialization starts here in Cape Town. In this very biodiverse ecosystem. So the Cape Floral region is a World Heritage Site, and properties are added all the time. Table Mountain National Park is one of the first properties that get added to this growing World Heritage Site. So people think that the mountain it's not. It's part of a network of sites that constitutes the World Heritage Site. And it exists from the Eastern Cape, Western Cape, and goes into the Northern Cape as well. a great diversity in ecosystems. But the Cape Peninsula, taken across that region and that biome, is the most species rich in the whole floral kingdom in terms of numbers of species per square meter. And to think that this exists in a city, it has persisted. There's been very, very low extinction rates over the last. We think about the extinction event of the dinosaurs, right? When a lot of life in the oceans and on land went extinct. And since that time, throughout the different ice ages, the climate is really stable here, and there are very low levels of extinction, but the formation of new species continues over time. So there's this accumulation of biodiversity for a very, very long time. So you find the Cape Peninsula is not only the richest bit of land in the Cape Floral region, but it is comparable to the Amazon. It is richer in species per unit area than any block you'll draw. In 471 kilometers squared in the Amazon, the peninsula will have more. It has an endemism rate of 7%. That's a nice thing to say that very few people understand. But the only places that have, so an endemic species is one that occurs only locally. The mountain has 158 plant species. That's nowhere else in the world. Never mind the floral kingdom. So that constitutes about a 7% endemism. Those kinds of 7% figures one only finds in really, really big islands that are very, very isolated. So in the the South Pacific. So thinking about it being on a continent where species can travel, it's utterly exceptional that we have this not only as part of the Cape Floral region, but as this mountain isolate, separated from the rest of its cousins by the Cape Flats. So the biodiversity is profound. I have a biodiversity background and I really love plants. And one of my hobbies is to use this iNaturalist app to go and observe different species, which can then be identified. I will never in my life get to summit that total species list. So there's about 200 and, not that it means anything, but there's about 2,250 species, right? 250, 286, the jury's still out. They're discovering things all the time. There are biodiversity people who will try their whole life to see all those species in one lifetime. I don't know if one can actually beat that record. So it challenges people that in a context that I can speak about. I'm not a climber. I think I have a good deal of common sense. And so plants are great. They don't really pose a risk to my life. But yes, the biodiversity is, South Africa is a funny place because in terms of our geographical, if we look at how much ocean surrounds us and how far we are from other parts of the world, we always have the biggest in the southern hemisphere things, the biggest mall in the southern hemisphere, the biggest man-made forest, the biggest this, that. But these numbers about the Cape Peninsula in terms of biodiversity, one can actually trust if you were to go and do the reading. The biodiversity is insane. And there's so many people who encounter the mountain in many different ways, but the biodiversity is still so available to us. And it wouldn't be there if it wasn't a mountain.
Hi.
Hi there.
I'm going to bring us back into the gallery. And the springboard of the Mount Analogue. And I think that we need to think a little bit about some mystical thinking in terms of why Mount Analogue, and why any mountain as such. And I don't believe it's about reaching the top. And I certainly don't think as an artist that it's about numbers or species. I think it's about one's imagination. And so what the mountain offers, Table Mountain, and in this case Mount Analogue, it offers a possibility for our imagination to journey into something that is improbable. And, unlike science, and I know the worlds are beginning to diverge ever so slightly, but it's not weighable, and it's not something that you can measure. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of background about Dumal. He was a student of Gurdjieff, and Gurdjieff was an incredible mystic who I'm sure most of you know, and he pointed at the fourth way, and the fourth way is neither one's willing or one's thinking. One's willing as in, I have the will, I'll climb that mountain, and one's thinking, where we are all right now, I believe, submerged in this world of thinking. Every bit of knowledge is a click away. And what Gurdjieff pointed at was the fourth way. And the fourth way was the joining of both thinking and willing. But not that should be easy, that in itself is an incredible quest. So Dumal was just taking a fragment out of Gurdjieff's thinking in this tiny little novelette. And I think what he was pointing at was that it's not about reaching any summit, but it's about what you see along the way. And the one chapter points that if you just move one little rock, it could avalanche that whole mountain, which brings us back to Table Mountain and our own interaction with Table Mountain. It's been monetized, it's been used in a way not necessarily for its own good. It's amazing that we, what you're saying about the species, that it's all survived. But, if we have to listen to the mountain and really sense what it's really, really saying, it could perhaps point us in a completely different pattern. And part of the reason why we look and why we love mountains is that it's so rhythmic and so patterned. And Table Mountain, with its very static top, it's so solid. It's both a background and a foreground. It's never just in the back. It's always just comes right forward. And I'm just going to hop across to the peace poles. I don't know, did you speak about the peace poles? So the peace poles were planted in the 1980s, and one was planted because Table Mountain is this incredible center of power. It was planted, one in Table Mountain and one at St. George's in town. And there were people who actually took the peace pole and tore it off the earth, off the mountain, and it was later put into Robben Island, where it still remains. So this idea that Table Mountain can be this center of peace, I think is an incredibly powerful possibility that we should really listen to. And I think that part of making art and part of thinking around environments and ecologies is this idea that we could change things. And I think that one of the possibilities and one of the changes that most of us would like to see now is a world that is much more peaceful. And if you look at the history of Table Mountain going back straight away, it was colonized, it was peopled, and it is walked, it is traversed in a certain way. And the thinking is that perhaps it shouldn't be traversed in those ways. Perhaps it should be a possibility to think and to wonder and to imagine in ways that are not serving us, to scrap those ways which aren't serving us, and to listen much more deeply to ways that possibly could serve us. And I don't know how the science and the art can be merged, but it seems, the information is so fascinating. How does one merge that into the unconscious and into the space of making and willing in terms of visual? So, thank you.
I think me and the guy singing outside would probably be a good panel.
Glenn, you spoke about some of the aspects that make Table Mountain particularly special and particularly unique in the world. And Cheryl, you spoke about what mountains offer us in terms of our thinking, particularly as kind of these geological formations, and what they can reveal about our own aspirations. I'd like to ask, I think the two of you, with those things in mind, what archetypes do you think could apply to Table Mountain? I know that it has, and the formation of the city is really centered around the mountain, what the mountain offered to people that were here much earlier on, but also to the Europeans who arrived, and there's a reason why they settled there. And so, looking at this area and the role that the mountain plays in that, archetypes, maybe a word that Dumas would have used more, but I wonder if you could both respond to that.
I'm going to ask you to go first so that I can ask Jonathan what he means by archetype.
Okay. So for me, the first archetype is the hurikwacha, the fact that it is this god that arrives out of the sea, and this notion of the sea-land archetype, this joining of both sea and land, and it's less of an archetype, but more of an elemental sense. So for me, the archetype is this stage, actually, this idea of this incredible platform or stage of the mountain, which is, you use the word bowed, which bows an entire city. So for me, there isn't one archetype as such, but the thing of it being godly in the sense of nature and pagan, and this idea that the mountain holds this energy which is stronger than anything. I suppose there are the archetypes of the lion and the devil. Those things bracketed, but that's about it.
I think I'm gonna, if I can take that as a starting point, to share some of the indigenous cultural information, because the language is interesting. And one of the things that, of course, the word which is now ubiquitous, hurikwacho, sort of comes out of nowhere about 15 years ago. And then everyone sort of learns about it, and then people start saying it as if we've always known it. And of course, we haven't, and we don't know where that word comes from, if it's something that survives in the journals of the early colonists, or if it's something that comes down from Namibia, where people remember stories about what was here. So Huri Kwacha, which has become corrupted into Hurikwacho. And it's an interesting word because it has one of the clicks that's not found in the Nguni languages. So it's so it's Hurikwacha. means sea mountain. But then Credo Mutua writes about the role of Table Mountain when in the Xhosa language, when the god Kamata is busy separating the land from the water, it is then bound up in various parts of the world, and we don't all know where, but the southern one, this is the watcher of the south that keeps the land from receding back into the water, sort of this edge of up until here and no further. And I think that it being this promontory is maybe an archetype of landedness, of the terrestrial, of the first domain of mankind. Of course, now we're going into the oceans, but it wasn't always that way. And a lot of that is because of its form, right? We do have coastal mountains in other places, but who cares? And one of the interesting things about the mountain that gives it that other way of looking at it is its shape, is its size. It's not particularly high. You go across the Cape Flats and you can go to Stellenbosch, Ceres, Tulbagh, and you have mountains that are double the height of Table Mountain, but you don't see it because it's the slow rise. But here we have a kilometer of mountain that goes straight down to sea level with these magnificent cliffs. Very few places where you can see a rise from sea level right to the top. The really hard sandstone makes it cliff forming. It's a particular cliff forming kind of setup that we have here. So beyond the species lists, just the imposing and beautiful flat top, it's unique. We find we go to the Karoo, we go to the Americas, we go to Australia, we find regions where we have hills that have these flat tops, right? But this is one of the few major mountains that has a 3-kilometer long flat top. And it's actually the name Table Mountain. It's named twice by two different people, disconnected, 100 years apart in two different languages. So in the 1500s, there's a Portuguese guy that comes past here and names it Table Mountain, or something to do with table. 100 years later, there's a Dutch guy who names it Table Mountain. So there's this interesting speaking of the mountain, this language, that I find absolutely fascinating. And then the Khoi word, huri kwacha, sea mountain. The parting of these two domains, the terrestrial and the aquatic, it rising from the sea, is something that, of course, makes it spoken about by sailors. And, Sir Francis Drake talks about the fairest cape in all the world. Its shape does speak. It's enigmatic. It is not definitely just interesting geology and species, whether, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts when it comes to Table Mountain. And it's, as a local, it's almost a bit irksome when it is just packaged as this tourism thing. This postcard, that little yellow rectangle, to take a picture and go home. I mean, shame, there's no problem with that, but I'll always feel that it belongs a little bit more to me than to those that aren't from here. Yeah. But I think that we find that all over the world, but we don't find Table Mountain all over the world.
Stunning. Thank you. I want to just quickly add on a little bit to something that both of you picked up on. Obviously, you were mentioning that Huri Kwacha is, the mountain from the sea. And that story, as much as we don't know, exactly kind of where it comes from, or it's hard to verify that exactly. It's interesting to me that idea of land and sea is even mirrored by the earliest Europeans who came to the area. So Bartholomew Dias was the first European Portuguese to round the Cape. And shortly afterwards, there's this poet, also Portuguese, who writes, epic poems in this age of discovery of the Europeans and all of the new things that they were discovering. And he writes about Table Mountain specifically as a titan of the land, and which he titles Adamastor, that vast secret promontory called the Cape of Storms, one of the rugged titans. And this titan, kidnaps or seduces the daughter of the Titan of the sea, and this starts this giant battle that continues over century and millennia between the land and the sea. And eventually, the Titan of the land, Adamastor, is defeated. But as his last act of defiance, he lays down to mark the end of the land. And that point is Adamastor, that point is Table Mountain. And if you think about the Portuguese explorers, that's the end of the land, it marks the end of Africa. And then it becomes also incredibly important because the mountain provides a source of fresh water for the Europeans, which, even though they landed, as you were saying, in Saldanha Bay earlier, which is a more suitable bay, more suitable harbor, it's difficult to access fresh water. And so, on that journey that we're all familiar with, that's one of the reasons why this bay in particular was chosen. Seeing as we're bringing up also that point, and from what I was mentioning earlier, that mountains signify this kind of journey, but they also signify the obstacle to be overcome along the way. We know that in the geography of Cape Town, particularly in the history of the city, it also poses geological challenges for the city, and has been kind of identified or marked off systematically by the town planners in a previous generation. And there's this interesting, fascinating book by David Lurie, he's a photographer, which I encourage you all to check out. Basically, he does something similar to what Hokusai does with Mount Fiji. He's targeting all of these views of a city, with this mountain as a backdrop or a subject matter. And so he starts in Kailicha and kind of journeys forward through Mitchell's Plain, Guguletu, Langa, and kind of edges his way close to the city, and then ends in Clifton and eventually on the mountain. And Ashraf Jamal wrote a text for this, and he speaks about life below the mountain really remaining balkanized and split among grid lines that defined colonialism and apartheid. And so perhaps touching on that, but, identifying some of the obstacles that are there to be overcome, and some of the possibilities and the challenges and the journeys that those pose to us. And also thinking about, what it takes to climb a mountain, what it takes to climb a rock face. And I wonder, Cheryl, if maybe we can start with you.
What's the question?
The question is really like, what obstacles, what challenges, what possibilities does the mountain pose?
Well, I think I would like to firstly point to safety and gender safety. And I know this wasn't your question, but it was one of the little rabbit holes I fell into, looking up the stories of Table Mountain. I know the history book likes to say that the first woman was Lady Anne Barnard, who climbed the mountain. One wonders how she did it, but apparently she strapped her shoes, and when she got there, they had a picnic. I find that a very strange first edition of a female climbing the mountain. But I know as a woman that I never feel safe now climbing the mountain, and I don't know, I'm sure men also feel that. So in terms of hazards, just the safety of one's own self, not because you're going to fall off a rock, but because there are predators or people sitting, And so my question to myself was, Table Mountain is accessible, and maybe that's why people predate on the mountain, but I thought maybe there's something else as well. Maybe there's this thing of human sacrifice, and maybe that also needs to take place. I know it's a bit wild, but it was a thought that occurred to me. So that's my first thought. I walk every day, I walk somewhere, and my thought, and I'm sure many of us feel that, is that we don't feel very safe on the mountain. And the other thing, which is much more of a metaphysical question, is, does one actually want to climb a mountain? Does one want to reach the top? Or is it just the wanderlust, as Sonnet says? Is it the imagination and the wandering that is actually the draw card? And in that, there are no obstacles except the actual drive and need to go and, actually get into the mountain. So I don't believe there are obstacles. I believe that we create those obstacles. And whilst you were talking about the David Lurie book, I thought to myself how easy it is to take the the cable car, and to see the view from the top, and also how we can see its top. So that thing of looking at the top or looking down has been made so easy. Is that helpful? Is that helpful in terms of one's own self, to be able to be, taken up so quickly? On a more comic note, the guy, I had this idea of a sculptor who had this very big pink thing, it's almost like a huge breast, but the size of this whole room. And I had this idea that he took that pink thing up in the cableway as sort of, as a comment on how humans go up and down on this cableway. Anyway, I'm way off topic.
It's art, right? So one can be controversial. Maybe one should be.
Yeah, one should be.
You mentioned safety twice, and it's made me think, and it's incredibly interesting, and I'm going to be speaking about it as a metaphor.
Yes.
I don't want you to think about it in terms of this is my wish, or this is my actual opinion about the pragmatics of things. When one thinks about the time you felt safe and the time that you are unsafe now, and the times when we do feel safe and when we don't, it leads us to act in different ways. It modifies our behavior individually and collectively. And the collectives we form are often not neutral. I'm going to go to a film that I love, one of my favorites. It's called Doubt. Starts as a play, it's a film, and these two nuns go through the most in trying to get rid of a priest. And their accusations aren't really founded. And then at the end, because they are righteous women, they speak to each other. And they say, one sister says, I have such doubt, I can't really sleep well anymore. And the Mother Superior says, maybe we're not supposed to sleep that well. Can we ask ourselves the question, maybe we're not supposed to feel so safe?
Absolutely.
There are reasons that Cape Town was safe then, or Table Mountain was safe then, and now it's not. I don't think that the feeling of unsafety on the mountain back then, I think it was an oddity. I think in most places people felt unsafe, and it's just that feeling of unsafeness has spread because now Table Mountain is integrated with the people where it wasn't before. So it's not like the unsafety on Table Mountain is new. It's just shared. And it's something that joins us in a common experience. And when we are up there, should we feel as safe should we feel safe while people down at the bottom are not? But the mountain persists as a guardian, both for people escaping the city and for those who are the ones causing fear to take refuge in nooks and crannies. But yet it persists. If there is a time when there will be a mountain without mankind, it will mirror its beginnings. Formation, consolidation at a time when we are not here, and if we, through our continual actions, remove ourselves, the mountain will persist in whatever form we don't know, having borne witness to the rise and fall, not only of its Himalayan-sized predecessor, but of its very comical monkey-like species called Homo sapiens. But it's just metaphorical, but maybe we shouldn't sleep so soundly. Maybe we shouldn't feel so safe.
Thank you very much. The mountain persists. I think that's a beautiful message to leave us with. Would anyone like to add anything?
A question, or like a reflection on Samuel's piece. It's a visual question, but also like a reality about fire and fire on the mountain. And it's something I think about when I look at your work, but it's also, I suppose, color, and it's the reality of Cape Town. So I was just curious about what fire on the mountain means to somebody about biodiversity, but also as an artist. What is fire on the mountain?
I think if a fire's got to the mountain, things are pretty bad, because that'll sort of be the last spot that it hits, and it'll be sort of a signal of bad things that are happening. It'll be able to be seen all around. It's not necessarily a fire in that one, but more, for me, golden hour, just of the magic hour, just as dusk forms. But yeah, what would a fire be burning, per se? On stone, there's obviously shrubs and some plants and stuff, but it would be able to be contained in some way, right? You, the master of mountains.
The fires are very important for the mountain, for the plants for the protea and the other. So, fires are, if you live close to the mountain, there are fires every 5 years, you can be sure. And I don't know, you haven't been here recently, but there's been an enormous fire literally spread within a couple of hours across the peninsula. Whoops. Huge.
So, from a biodiversity point of view, it's exactly the same as Australia, because we used to be connected in this Gondwana continent, and so we share many species, particularly southwestern Australia, in Perth, and the southwestern Cape. Fire is important in the genesis of man. The thing that got the ape-like ancestors onto the plains, walking upright, having a visage, fires creating grassland, so that our ancestors don't need to be in the branches anymore, but have to stand up. This doesn't happen without fire. We then become, as we are now, the proponents of fire, the center of the fire, but we get fire originally from nature. It predates us, but we use it now. Like the indigenous people used it to control the movement of wild animals, to provide pasture for their own livestock. In terms of Table Mountain and the rest of Fynbos, fire is essential for biodiversity, but fires that are too frequent doesn't allow plants to mature and produce seed. So it's a double-edged sword. When we look at a peninsula that's been peopled for so long, undoubtedly, most of the ignition sources are anthropogenic, are human. And so we are integral to this ecosystem, at least for the last 200,000 years. So I can talk about it from that point of view. But it also goes with that feeling of being unsafe, right? But I think we're much more scared of people than we are fire, to be perfectly honest.
Pass it to Cheryl. Is there something you'd like to add?
Well, around fear and fire, it's an incredibly primal feeling. It takes over one's entire body. It inflames the entire body, and we mirror it straight off. I've recently had a friend who died with fire, and that choice, in a way, of igniting oneself, it's the most unbelievably creative, inflammatory act, actually, to be, So this idea that fire can be contained in a candle, and you can look at it and it's beautiful and it's contained, and it can be completely wild, and it can be anything in between that. And this idea that fire is so transformative, the phoenix, that one can burst forth out of fire and become something else. So fire as one of the elements of Table Mountain, because with cloud, water, fire, and earth. That's for me another reason why it holds this incredible power. It contains those four elements in wholeness.
One more question.
Touching on that is obviously, you've touched on the fact that there's water, that Table Mountain offers us at the same time as, it offers to all of us fresh water all the time. And we have gone into them, also the rituals, the religious rituals that happen on the mountain are vast and varied. If you want to add to that, there's so much more to add.
I'm not sure if anyone wants to tackle this.
Talking of fire, they've actually, as of yesterday, banned groups making fires because of the last fire. So people go weekly, daily up into the mountain, do the rituals, but no fire is allowed. But it's also so varied, those groups who go, groupings who go up, and also so primal. It's something that one wants to do.
But the water is so much history and tradition and stories and myths. And I'm thinking of the lost ring just here.
Yeah, I'm just going to add like a minute of that because then I need to run. But so this local area that we're in, it was recorded that the Khoi people called it Kamisa. And there's quite a lot of things that have also been commercialized and made quite sexy, this word Kamisa. But it's actually coming from Kamisa, and Kami or Kama is water in many of the Khoi languages. And it's because of that water, that constant supply, because of the tablecloth, where water constantly seeps through. It condenses on the mountain, it filters through that sandstone and comes out as springs and flows into the city bowl, what is today the city bowl. This is why the Khoi could be here with their cattle and their sheep. This is why the San could do hunter-gathering here. This is why the refreshment station could be built in the gardens that we have. The Kamisa stream is still flowing through it. If you're walking up, the stream on your right is the Kamisa stream, and it comes from Oranjezicht. And so water was even central to the name of the place where people were. But the name of the broader area was acknowledged in the name of the broad peninsula area, which is Khoikaib, which means cloud covered. And of course, even if there's no rain, this is where the water comes from that goes into the spring.
Stunning. Glenn, I think we have to thank you very much. I know that you have to run, and I don't want to keep you too long. I would also like just to inform everyone that it is Glenn's birthday today, so perhaps we can give him a round of applause. But yeah, thank you really so much for being here and for sharing all of that information through this conversation and even the conversation that we had earlier. Yeah, I really feel like I've learned a lot. You know, Cheryl, you spoke about science and the creative world, you know, but I think part of the story that the mountain has to tell us in general, you know, is it has its own language, its own visual language for telling us that story and for kind of guiding us. And I think that background is part of that visual language. How is it that those formations, you know, came about? Why is it that the botany or the biology of the mountain, you know, is so particular, has particular hues and shades and colors? How does it, you know, even the tablecloth, you know, that signifies something different. So, you know, those are the things for me that visually, you know, would tie together with an exhibition like this. I'm not sure if anyone has anything to add, but thank you so much for being here. I'm sure we can also have conversations afterwards. Thanks a lot.